Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Men I've Never Been, a Memoir, by Michael Sadowski, narrated by Charlie Thurston. Disclaimer. Listeners should also be aware that the character dialogue in Men I've Never Been is true to the memory of the author, and as such includes profanity, one instance of a racial slur, numerous sexist slurs, and many instances of homophobic slurs and other forms of anti-gay harassment. Author's note. This is a work of memory. Although I have consulted with family members and friends to check my recollection of various facts, this book represents interpretations and opinions that are solely my own. It is based on true events, but I have reconstructed scenes, dialogue, and other details with the goal of rendering what I remember, and especially how I remember it, as faithfully as possible. Many conversations depicted in this book also contain what I call anchor lines, statements that I recall verbatim. I would bet my life on the accuracy of these words. There are no composite characters, but the names and identifying details of many people and locations have been changed in the interest of anonymity. Before. The Professor. Before all the times I failed at being a man, I succeeded at being a professor, or at least that's what my father said. In my second earliest memory, he and I are on a mystery drive in his sky blue Galaxy 500. It's July, or maybe August, 1966, before most cars had air conditioning. The windows are wide open, and a sickly sweet medicinal odor wafts in with the summer heat. Peeking over the dashboard, I can see the looming stacks of a chemical factory churning out plumes of pink and silver smoke. Then we pull into a gravel parking lot, a cloud of gray dust kicking up under our wheels. "Where are we?" My father's only answer, a wide, toothy grin. With no seatbelt to undo, I tumble easily out of the passenger seat, and we walk toward a flat-roofed, one-story structure identified only by a black hand-painted road sign I can more or less sound out as Club Royale. As I would later find out, Club Royale was one of the many places my father frequented that my mother wouldn't dignify with the word bar. To her, places of this ilk were beer joints, dumps she wouldn't be caught dead in under any circumstances. The inside of the Club Royale is dark, impenetrable to my 4-year-old eyes, and it smells like that combination of stale beer, cork, and old tobacco smoke that permeates dive bars and low-end fraternity houses everywhere. Right away, it's clear that my father has a following here. From the moment we walk in, people start waving and calling out John this and John that, which seems strange to me. I'd always heard people call my father Josh, rhymes with Josh, a Polish nickname from my immigrant grandmother that stuck with the rest of the family. But here he's John, and everybody loves him. That seems a little strange to me, too. Between my parents, my father was decidedly the extrovert. With wavy brown hair only starting to gray at 48, pale green eyes and a ready smile, Josh was at his best with casual acquaintances. He would often get into angry tussles with strangers about their lousy driving, how long they took with the bank teller while he waited in line, or the price of an item he thought was too high. To my mother and my 6 older siblings, he was a serial disappointment, never following through on plans, never showing up when he said he'd give them a ride, or if he did show up, never arriving sober. But to the regulars at his beer joints, people who knew his name but not much else, my father was friendly and funny, a great guy to have around. "Whoa, John, haven't seen you here in a while. How you been?" After acknowledging the greetings of his admirers, Josh sits me up on a bar stool and grabs a copy of the Daily News, a working-class New York tabloid that probably could have been found in every other beer joint in central Jersey. He holds it up high so that the widest possible audience can see it. Hey, look it!" Josh shouts, trying to capture the attention of the entire room. Then he barks, "Michael!" He sounds like he's furious, but I've heard this tone before, so I know what he's up to. "What's it say on that paper?" Falling right into my father's trap, some incredulous barfly pipes up, "That little kid? He can't read that." "Wanna bet?" Then another bark from Yash, this one even louder and angrier sounding than the first. "Michael, what's it say?" Slowly sounding out the headlines in block letters that are a trademark of the Daily News front page to this day, I intone haltingly but mostly accurately headlines like, "The Blackout. Nobody digs power flop. 3 slain. Bomb rips Saigon." This being near the height of the Vietnam War, the headlines often include the names of places and political figures I stumble on. But do my father's cronies at Club Royale know the difference? And even if some do, sounding out Saigon for Saigon is still pretty good for a kid who's not even in preschool. "John, I'm gonna buy you a drink," says one new believer, then another. Yash opens up the paper and the game continues with page 4, page 7, the back page sports news. The more headlines I read, the more beer and whiskey my father gets for free. "What'll you have, John?" "Shot and a beer." Over and over. I probably get free Cokes out of the bets, too. I don't remember. Though many decades later, I can recall quite clearly the location of the men's room at Club Royale, so I must have been taking in a fair amount of liquid myself. After an hour or two, my father and I walk out of Club Royale and back into the hot summer sun, the chemical odor from across the highway now tinged with the sweet smell of victory. Then we spin out of the gravel parking lot and drive home, leaving only wonderment and a cloud of gray dust behind us. "You took him to a beer joint? In the middle of the afternoon? What the hell's wrong with you?" I don't recall a single instance of my parents ever speaking lovingly to one another. Whatever tenderness might have once existed between Yash and Sophie, the head-turningly handsome couple in the Niagara Falls honeymoon portrait that now sat unframed and wrinkled in our family photo box, Yash in his green army uniform, and Sophie with the long brown hair, brown eyes, and aquiline nose of a strong-willed 1940s movie heroine. It was long gone by the time their 7th child came along. So I was neither surprised nor troubled by Sophie's reaction when Yash, too many shots and beers in him to know better, bragged about the feat we had just pulled off at Club Royale. "He was reading, out of the paper. Those guys there, they couldn't believe it," he answered with a gassy smile, obviously tone-deaf to what my mother thought of all this. "I tell you, Soph, that kid can read." "Yeah? I'll read you." This was one of Sophie's favorite comebacks in her exchanges with Yash. Take a verb he had just used and turn it on him as a threat, albeit a nonsensical one. I don't remember what happened next. In all likelihood, realizing she would get nowhere with Yash in his state of loopy oblivion, Sophie just sighed, rolled her eyes, and walked away. What I do remember is that my father loved the Club Royale story and retold it on many occasions, prophetically referring to me in it as the professor whenever he did. Always a man of stock tales and signature catchphrases, Yash incorporated the line, "John, I'm gonna buy you a drink," into his regular repertoire. And whenever I heard it, I swelled with pride, knowing I was exactly the boy my father wanted me to be. My first memory, even earlier than the one at Club Royale, is of another game show in which I am the sole contestant and undefeated champion. This time, the set is a tiny kitchen on Lincoln Avenue in Somerville, the center of central New Jersey. The walls are in wood paneling the color of honey, and a framed replica of the Last Supper hangs on the wall behind the studio audience. Sophie, Yash, my 3 brothers, and my 3 sisters, all sitting around a sparkling gold formica table. The MC, my 15-year-old brother Larry, is firing out the questions, and I'm firing back the answers without missing a beat. "How much is 2 and 2? 4. How much is 4 and 4? 8. How much is 8 and 8? 16. This doubling sequence I had memorized, there was no real addition involved, continues all the way up to, "How much is 2,048 and 2,048? 4,096. Then cheers, laughter, and applause. All of it for me. Every so often I'm asked, maybe in a writing workshop, maybe before going under anesthesia, to close my eyes, take myself back to a favorite place, and bask in the warmth of the feelings it evokes. I don't go to a sun-drenched beach in the Caribbean, or to a hammock on a spring afternoon. Instead, I go back more than 50 years to that little kitchen, or sometimes that seedy bar. Back to a time when all it took to be the boy everyone cheered for was the right answer. Back before I started school, when knowing the right answer could bring either praise from the teacher or taunts from the other boys in class. Back before my father started disappearing a lot, and my parents' arguing turned to shouting, then pushing and shoving, then something even worse. Back before my siblings started disappearing from the house too, one by one. Back before I had any idea what it meant to be a man, or even a boy. Back before it all felt impossible to escape, no matter how old I grew, what I accomplished, or how far I ran. Part 1. Noise. I remember the gleams and glooms that dart across the schoolboy's brain, the song and the silence in the heart, that in part are prophecies, and in part are longings wild and vain. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. When someone with the authority of a teacher, say, describes the world, and you are not in it, there is a moment of psychic disequilibrium, as if you looked in the mirror and saw nothing. Adrienne Rich. 1. Schoolboy. My kindergarten teacher was Mrs. Clark, and my first-grade teacher was Miss Langer. But my first real teacher, the one who schooled me in the ways of the world and how I should and shouldn't move through it, was Sheila Feldman. If a casting director had been scouting Vanderveer Elementary School for a live-action Peanuts movie, Sheila Feldman would have been flown to Hollywood to read for the role of Peppermint Patty. Shoulder-length, dishwater brown hair, parted on the side and in need of a shampoo, pale, freckled skin, and a boy's shirt 3 sizes too big. Her voice had that same sandpapery timbre, too, like she was talking and clearing phlegm from her throat at the same time. Ultimately, though, I don't think Sheila would have gotten the role. Because where Peppermint Patty always had that chummy sweetness, trying to buck up Charlie Brown when he thought the whole world was against him, Sheila Feldman's way of dealing with a misfit boy was entirely different. Always referred to by both her first and last names, Sheila Feldman already had a reputation by the age of 5. There were only 2 kindergarten teachers at Vanderveer, my teacher, the young, pretty Mrs. Clark, and Sheila's teacher, the grandmotherly Mrs. Batterley. Their rooms were adjacent to one another, and peeking through the pass-through doorway, my classmates would whisper and point. "Uh-oh, there's Sheila Feldman. Sheila Feldman's in trouble again. Did you hear what Sheila Feldman called Mrs. Batterley? She made her teacher cry. You better stay away from Sheila Feldman." So I tried, and managed to throughout kindergarten. Sheila Feldman wasn't in my first-grade class either, but that fall I saw her almost every morning. Before school, she would hang out by the main facade of the building where a row of leafy bushes grew, and scowl at passers-by. I felt sorry for Sheila because no one, not even the teachers, seemed to like her. And since we knew each other a little from the year before when the kindergarten classes had combined for special activities, I'd say a tentative, "Hi, Sheila," whenever I saw her. She'd say hi back in a low, gravelly monosyllable I found hard to read. Was she surprised I knew who she was? Was she mad at me for bothering her? Or did she think it was nice that at least somebody, a boy no less, was paying attention to her? One morning I was walking toward A9, my first-grade classroom. I felt relieved not to see Sheila loitering in her usual spot. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, she popped out and dragged me behind the bushes. Despite the fact that she was about the same size as me, Sheila was incredibly strong and obviously very determined. It went down something like this. "You want to fight? I'm gonna fight you," Sheila said. This made no sense to me. "Fight? I don't want to fight. What do you mean?" "Why are you always talking to me?" "I don't know." Because no one likes you and I feel sorry for you seemed not the right thing to say at that moment. Sheila grabbed at my shirt and pulled at my hair. It stung. "What, are you scared?" she asked. "I'm not scared. I just don't want to fight a girl." "You're a girl. No, you're a sissy. That's what you are. A little sissy boy. Sissy, sissy, sissy." Next, a kick in the shin, then a hard punch in the gut. "What did I do?" I asked, flabbergasted and by now on the ground. But I got no answer. Once Sheila achieved her apparent goal of dragging, punching, and kicking me into a state of stunned humiliation, she ran away. Maybe she saw a teacher coming. Maybe she was exasperated that I wasn't fighting back. Despite Sheila's brutish behavior, I just couldn't bring myself to hit a girl. In fact, I couldn't imagine hitting or wanting to hit anybody. I came out from behind the bushes and cleaned the mulch off my clothes as best I could. I was relieved not to see Sheila or anyone else looking at me, or worse, laughing. But as I walked toward Miss Langer's room, I started adding some things up. I thought about story time. How when I read aloud, I'd sometimes get too excited, wave my hands, let my voice go up to a pitch that made other kids snicker, and Miss Langer stifle a nervous laugh. Then I thought about arts and crafts, when I'd obsess over whether to use aquamarine or teal to paint my plaster of Paris horse. Then I thought back to kindergarten, when I wanted to cook imaginary dinners in the Susie Homemaker kitchen instead of building houses and bridges with Lincoln logs, like all the other boys in the opposite corner of the room. I made that mistake only once, the day Charlene Miller told me that the kitchen was for girls and I should get out. And I started to wonder if maybe it was all connected. When I reached A9, I lined up with the other kids, the word sissy still playing on a continuous loop inside my head, and said nothing. Admitting to my classmates that I'd just gotten beaten up by a girl seemed like a bad idea, and telling them what she'd called me seemed like an even worse one. And I knew that what I really wanted to do, cry, was completely out of the question. Miss Langer was pretty nice and probably would have done something to make sure Sheila was punished if I told on her. But then what would I have become in Miss Langer's eyes? The thing Sheila said I was? Telling my parents what happened with Sheila seemed like an even worse idea. Yash was out at his beer joints even more often than before, except now without his headline-reading sidekick along for the ride. And when he was around, the bickering between Sophie and him had escalated to something worse. "Get the hell away from me! You're nothing but a goddamn drunk!" "Bullshit! To hell with you, you goddamn bitch!" Shouting and cursing was now my parents' default mode of communication, as much a part of the structure of our house as the beams and the walls. But the first of their altercations that really scared me took place on a Saturday afternoon in front of the gas stove that sat in the corner of our kitchen. There I saw the familiar shouts of "goddamn this, shit that," and "son of a bitch, get physical." Yash holding Sophie's wrist in a grip so tight it made the veins bulge. Sophie arming herself with a metal soup ladle, attempting to fight off Yash with blows to the head. While Yash staggered Sophie back toward the lit stove, its two front burners blazing, I sat in stunned silence as I pictured my mother, then the kitchen, then the entire house going up in flames. Then there was the biggest challenge of all. Somehow, amid all the swearing and shoving, Sophie and Yash were also apparently having sex, because the year I was in kindergarten, my brother Thomas was born. Thomas started out like all babies, a crying, drooling blob that wasn't much of a threat to my status as pet little brother. But he grew into his blonde, blue-eyed cuteness at about a year old. He started to do and say funny things, like calling Larry Lala, and before long the family galaxy had a new star. So on the day of my big run-in with Sheila, I just followed my typical routine. I walked home for lunch, sat at the head of the gold Formica table in our kitchen, and ate my SpaghettiOs. Then I quietly stepped into the living room and sat on the opposite end of the sofa from my mother, who was humming and rocking Thomas to sleep in preparation for his afternoon nap. With the volume turned low so that I didn't wake the baby, I watched Jeopardy! I didn't understand most of the questions, but it was nice to know there was still a place out there where people got applause and won things just for knowing the right answers. I saw Sheila Feldman a couple of times around school after our rumble in the bushes. She shot me a few dirty looks, mumbled a few insults. Then I didn't see her at all for what I eventually realized had been a long time. I wasn't sure if her family had moved or why she'd suddenly disappeared, but I didn't want to ask anyone for fear they'd start asking me why I cared so much. Months went by, then years. It was pretty obvious Sheila wasn't coming back. Still, I never felt safe again walking past those bushes. I just couldn't shake the feeling there was something back there. Something I feared but should never talk about, waiting. 2. Athlete. Sissy. The word had now bored its way inside my head. It had carved out a space between my ears where it would echo every time my speech, my gestures, my play, my tears crept out of bounds. I hated this word. I wanted it gone. So I spent the rest of elementary school trying to replace it with another word from that ultimate test of American manhood: sports. Quarterback, running back, defensive end. It was the beginning of second grade, and my class was lined up outside our room on a still temperate early fall morning. Scott Kemper, Marcus Banks, and Doug Kellerman were wearing their Pop Warner jerseys, waving around forms for some football-themed fundraiser, and tossing out terms that were completely unfamiliar to me. I wanted desperately to join in this guy talk, be one of the masculine-sounding things they were naming, even if I had no idea what they were. But the football bus had long since left without me. When they passed out the information flyers for Pop Warner the previous spring, I stood up very publicly with just about all the other boys to take one. I even brought the form home and tried to discuss it with Yash one morning before school. "Yeah, you should go out for football," he bellowed at the kitchen table. It must have been a relief to see his seventh kid, who was starting to seem a little funny, show an interest in sports. But that was about all he had to contribute to the conversation. He didn't know a thing about the game. When it came to being a sports parent, Yash's score was basically 0. I can't think of a single time I threw him anything in our backyard but a can of beer. He never watched football, baseball, or basketball on TV. Nor did he ever spend Saturdays tossing a wiffle ball to his boys, like the dads I saw on television. Instead, he was tossing back shots at Club Royale or the VFW hall with his other boys. To be fair, though, I can't lay my poor preparation or lack of motivation for Pop Warner solely on Yash's feet. Up to this point, my entire body of knowledge about football came from having watched 5 minutes of a Sunday afternoon game, in which one team, the Green Bay Packers, turned it around against another team, the Dallas Cowboys, with a Hail Mary play just as the clock ran out. It all felt thrilling for a few minutes, and after the game I ran into my bedroom and jumped on and off my bed, pantomiming long passes and catches that simulated the game-ending touchdown. But I must have picked up one other thing watching that Sunday afternoon Packers-Cowboys game: that football was a rough and dirty world where I'd never fit in. Before I even noticed, the Pop Warner deadline came and went, and I never mentioned it again. The next spring, I came up with a new strategy to de-sissify myself. I went back to Yash with another form and got another booming response from the breakfast table. "Yeah, you should go out for baseball." I handed him the Little League application, which listed the pay-to-play fee, and asked if he'd write a check. First, he deflected my question. "I don't know where the checks are. Ask Mommy." Then he returned to his sports dad impersonation. "So, what position are you going to try out for?" I had no idea how to answer this question. There were very few positions I'd even heard of. I knew there was a first baseman, a second baseman, and a third baseman, but I had no way of explaining why I wanted to be one over the other. So I just named the only other position I knew. "I don't know. I was thinking about trying out for pitcher." "Oh, you're the one with the arm. I thought so." Another kid with another father might have felt encouraged by this response, inspired by this vote of confidence to make his dad proud. But it just made me suspicious. I thought, if my father thinks I have a good pitching arm, a notion he has no evidence to support, maybe this whole thing is baloney. But he was kind of supporting me, so I followed through and went to my mother with the application form. "Baseball? You don't know how to play baseball," Sophie decreed, obviously annoyed that I was even asking given my lack of interest and participation in sports up to this point. I should have known better. While Yash had pretty much continued on his merry, liquored-up way after Thomas's birth 2 years before, Sophie had sunk more deeply into the role of harried wife and mother, now with 8 children to feed and clothe. Her once deep brown hair graying fast, her face getting thinner, and her heart growing increasingly bitter at 45. By this point, my mother seemed to have less and less that gave her joy. Maybe the blonde 2-year-old she rocked to sleep on her lap while watching the afternoon soap operas, but certainly not the increasingly effeminate second grader who now ridiculously wanted to join Little League. "How would you even get there? Who's gonna take you?" asked Sophie rhetorically, to remind me that she didn't have a driver's license. "Daddy?" I offered as a counter, though now I realized she had checkmate. I had heard all the stories. My older siblings stranded in remote parts of town or in neighboring towns, waiting out in the cold in front of the YMCA or the pizzeria, while Yash, who was supposed to have picked them up, lost all track of time at a beer joint. So the deadline for Little League also came and went. I thought for a few days about asking my parents if I could join Boy Scouts. It wasn't really a sport, but I wouldn't sink an entire team if I screwed up, and at least it had the word boy in it. But after the baseball debacle, my brother Benny told me that the real reason Sophie said no to Little League was that we couldn't afford the fee. I didn't know if this was true or not, but Boy Scouts had a fee too, and meetings where I would need to be dropped off and picked up, so I didn't bother to ask. I knew I was going to have to solve this problem on my own. During the summers I was in elementary school, the local parks department ran an activities program at each of 7 or 8 parks around town, a sort of public day camp for kids whose parents couldn't afford the real thing. Our closest park was only 3 blocks from our house, on Clark Avenue, and was unimaginatively named Clark Avenue Park. It wasn't one of the better ones. It didn't have a pool or anything. It was just a dirt and grass field of swings, monkey bars, and picnic tables, bounded by an unpainted split-rail fence. But there were 2 ongoing tournaments you could take part in that vaguely approximated the experience of a competitive sport. First, there was tetherball, but after 3 or 4 games, I learned to avoid this humiliation before it could become Clark Avenue legend. I could never punch the ball hard enough, and I'd end up getting pinned to the pole, wrapped inside like a mummy propped up in a museum display. So, by process of elimination, knock hockey, a precursor to electric air hockey with a wooden board and puck, became my sport of choice. Despite my complete lack of athleticism, I was a passable knock hockey player. I could win an occasional game, and maybe even enjoy a string of 3 or 4 victories before somebody picked me off. That is, unless Debbie McNamara was around. Debbie was the undisputed, unstoppable champion of knock hockey at Clark Avenue. When she reached the winning score of 11 points, which she often did in less than a minute, she would dust off her hands and with a twinkly smile call out, "Game! Next victim!" Debbie was blonde, freckled, and tomboyishly cute, and her dominance of the game was so complete you couldn't blame her for flaunting it a little. Besides, I was more interested in her friend and frequent sidekick at the knock hockey table, Gina Rosario. Much more typically feminine than Debbie, Gina never stooped to play knock hockey. She seemed content to watch Debbie humiliate one boy after another while brushing her long brown hair. "Aren't you gonna play?" Gina asked me one day while I contemplated the wisdom of challenging Debbie to a game. "I don't know. Debbie always beats me. She beats everybody, said Gina with a roll of...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?